Oh, good to see you. Here we are together again. One more day, another new day to do the Father's will. And today I have a story for you about a peacemaker family. The father was a diplomat, a specialist in political peace. And he was a State Department guy. He'd grown up in Nigeria, but moved to the United States, and the State Department would send him all around the world to wherever the hot spots were on the planet, where hostilities were active or threatened. And he would draw on his background, his educational background in political science and law and philosophy. And since he'd had his early education before law school in Nigeria, people assumed that he'd had a worse education, when in fact it represented the best of the British system and was better than that of most of the people who were putting their noses up at his alleged basic level of education in political science and philosophy. Oh my. But his technique, when he would go to these places all around the world, and he'd live there for some months, usually, sometimes longer, is he would work with groups, bring them together, sometimes 2 by 2, sometimes 15 by 15, whatever group he could get together, in which it was reasonable to practice this kind of conversation, that he would teach them on the spot, that they would voice their concerns initially in ways that were totally blaming, totally angry, hurling insults at each other, and seeing the other person only through the lens of whatever atrocity had occurred or had been reported or was suspected or feared. And he would teach them to express their feelings and to connect those feelings with human needs, the human needs that they were missing, needing, that had been violated, that they cared about so much. And he insisted that the primary work in these meetings was not to negotiate this and that. The primary work was to break through to empathy, expressed by each side being able to give voice to the feelings and needs and concerns of the other side in the language that expressed understanding, so that that other side could say, yes, you've got it. That's exactly how we feel. That's exactly what we're needing. And when they had achieved that mutual understanding and that satisfaction, we have a human need to be understood, to be heard, to be understood. And then, once that was achieved, they could get on to the work of the particular plans, the strategies, the how-to, the negotiations that had to be worked out. And those negotiations would happen in record time once that first achievement. And it would take a long time. It would take, two of them, 40 minutes, or it would take that group for an hour, or however long it would take. This wise diplomatic peacemaker would patiently help them restate. And it can be so hard to listen and restate well. But that just opened the doors for progress again and again and again. And the mother in the family specialized in social peace. Her educational background was in nursing and religion and history. Also from this wonderful university in Nigeria where she had met her husband. And she learned a practice on a kind of, what shall I call it, a sabbatical in Ontario, working with a woman who had developed tremendous skill mediating when there were local conflicts that were heated and difficult and complicated. And what she would do, and what this mother of the family learned to do, and would find wherever she would go with her husband then, when she was with him on his diplomatic voyages. She'd find the group where she could practice these skills. And what the woman would do from Ontario, her name was Moira Hutchinson. What she would do would be to call a meeting, and she'd work hard to have representatives present from each of the stakeholder groups. It might be a business in which some accident had happened that had caused ecological damage and medical injury to people, and you'd have victims of that explosion, it might have been, or community people and political leaders, all the groups that were in some way involved. They had a stake in what was happening. And when they were gathered, the first thing they would do is she would have them tell a story from their personal experience of how they were connected to this turbulent difficulty that was so hard for people to be peaceful about. And telling the stories and listening to the stories of the others made it so much easier to empathize and understand. And after that empathy had been gained, she would go on to the second stage of the evening, in which they would work out the facts of what really happened. What happened? And in a controversy like this, the facts need to be established with care. That's the basic scientific labor in a situation like this, to establish controversial facts. with care. And then she would go on to the moral and ethical dimension, stage 3 in the process. And they would discuss that and come to as much mutual understanding and agreement as they could. And then the last stage, she would open up the spiritual and religious dimension. If anyone had reflections to offer, insights, illuminations, a loving impulse to share. That was what she did. And this woman, traveling around with her husband, learned to facilitate those sorts of meetings. And then there was a daughter. And she was the academic in the family. She had been born in the United States and had grown up in an urban area and been to a school where in high school she had been trained in peer mediation, where groups of students are trained to intervene safely in conflicts that break out. People begin to shout at one another, and it looks like violence could start to happen. Or maybe, you know, they wouldn't get involved if you have a sort of a mob battle going on, or there are other conditions. But she learned the skills of peer mediation. And as an academic, she learned how these were being taught even in primary school. People were being taught to identify their feelings, taught to be empathetic towards others, taught to express their needs in terms of I messages, talking about their feelings and their needs, not using language that accuses others. And this daughter studied how to teach people to observe carefully and express their observations in factual ways, free of moral and ethical interpretation and evaluation. And there's a tremendous discipline involved in learning to understand and to observe facts carefully without interpreting and without going on to the next stage of evaluating. So she specialized in that. And her psychology work had to do with, you know, showing how it is that personal peace, which has a lot to do with, in many cases for people, meditation, spirituality, religion, relates to social peace and political peace. And one evening, they were all together and they had a long conversation about peacemaking. And there was something very special about this evening together, because they devoted this evening to pooling perspectives and pooling experience relevant to the teaching, happy are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. And on they went. And it was observed that a lot of people don't understand that teaching, and they hear the word peacemaker, but they think the idea peaceful, as though if there's conflict going on around you, and you're just peaceful, you know, you're happy and you're content and you're not going to get involved. that's, you know, that's what you do. You're confused about the distinction between returning good for evil and returning nothing for evil. And in these ways, peacemaking gets overlooked. And they talked about personal peace a little bit, and they kind of role played the dialogue that sometimes goes on in conflicts that arise between the body and the soul. And the body is saying, oh, you soul, you stuffy old uptight, full of religion that just causes wars and is blah, blah, blah. And the soul is saying to the body, well, you body full of your urges and impulses that are unbeautiful, and on it would go. And then how when spirit comes in, really comes in, is realized as presence now within. Spirit is easy victor over both parties to this conflict and establishes peace. And on the basis of that spiritually motivated, empowered, gracious peace, social peacemaking and political peacemaking can proceed. But if we're not peaceful within, we can't do social peacemaking and we can't do political peacemaking. It is so easy for self-righteous anger to creep in. But peacemaking prevents fear and greed and anger. And each of these dimensions performs such important services. Political peace cures racial antagonisms insofar as it really becomes effective, and cures distrust of other nations. And it's the cure for war. Peacemaking is the cure for war. Oh my. And then, toward the end of the evening, they began to talk in more detail about this happy are the peacemakers, and the kind of happiness that you have in the difficult work of being engaged. There is a kind of happiness if you're engaged from that spiritually centered place. And they talked about the phrase, for they shall be called the sons of God. And there was some discussion about whether this term sons should be understood to include daughters of God as well, women as well as men. And after some discussion, they agreed, yes, this is intended to be understood as inclusive language. And finally, with his sense of humor and his philosophy, this and that, the father came in at the end and he said, you know, there's something that I've enjoyed for years about the future tense. They shall be called the sons of God. And they discussed about this for a while. And one person said, oh, future tense, don't make much of that. It's not something to pay attention to much. And then another family member said, well, you know, really the family of God has got these two meanings. On the one hand, everybody is a child of God. We are all family. And that is what we are teaching primarily in our work of peacemaking. We are all human beings. We share the deepest things of our factual nature. And there's this other meaning. You become a son or daughter of God by faith. And there is the family of the faithful, so to speak. And it connects people from every religion. Because once that spirit is out upon all flesh, once that spirit of God is within everybody, whoever gets it, whatever their intellectual system might be, if they really get it and they're really living it, they're part of that family. And here the father came in, said, well, if you ask about the scope of the family, on the one hand, everybody's in the family. On the, I can't say just two hands here, but it's also the case that some, not all, are part of the family of faith. And I look at this, they shall be called the sons of God, as an indication that there's a future dimension here. Beyond this life, our sonship with God is sealed. And in that sense, I just love it. We're all the children of God. Some of us are the children of God. None of us are the children of God yet. And I just kind of think that people think, I'm a child of God, you know, they don't realize that there's something essential that hasn't yet happened yet. And so for now, whatever is going on in your life and in our world, always know that you are a divinely created, infinitely loved, spiritually indwelt, having the Spirit of God within you. Evolutionary, free will, son or daughter of the living God, and a brother or sister to every person you meet. Good day.